Chapter 21. The next day, Louis called the intensive care unit at the EMMC. Norma's condition was still listed as critical. That was standard operating procedure for the first 24 hours following a heart attack. Louis got a cheerier assessment from Weybridge, her doctor, however. "I wouldn't even call it a minor myocardial infraction," he said. "No scarring. She owes you a hell of a lot, Dr. Creed." On impulse, Louis stopped by the hospital later that week with a bouquet of flowers and found that Norma had been moved to a semi-private room downstairs. A very good sign. Judd was with her. Norma exclaimed over the flowers and buzzed a nurse for a vase. Then she directed Judd until they were in water, arranged to her specifications, and placed on the dresser in the corner. "Mother's feeling ever so much better," Judd said dryly after he had fiddled with the flowers for the third time. "Don't be so smart, Judson," Norma said. "No, ma'am." At last, Norma looked at Louis. "I want to thank you for what you did," she said, with a shyness that was utterly unaffected and thus doubtly touching. "Judd says I owe you my life." Embarrassed, Louis said, "Judd exaggerates." "Not very damn much, he don't," Judd said. He squinted at Louis, almost smiling, but not quite. "Didn't your mother tell you never to slip a thank you, Louis?" She hadn't said anything about that, at least not that Louis could remember, but he believed she had said something once about false modesty being half the sin of pride. "Norma," he said, "anything I could do, I was pleased to do." "You're a dear man," Norma said. "You take this man of mine out somewhere and let him buy you a glass of beer. I'm feeling sleepy again, and I can't seem to get rid of him." Judd stood up with alacrity. "Hot damn! I'll go for that, Louis. Quick, before she changes her mind." The first snow came a week before Thanksgiving. They got another 4 inches on the 22nd of November, but the day before the holiday itself was clear and blue and cold. Louis took his family to Bangor International Airport and saw them off on the first leg of their trip back to Chicago for a visit with Rachel's parents. "It's not right," Rachel said, for perhaps the 20th time since discussions on this matter had commenced in earnest a month ago. "I don't like thinking of you rattling around the house alone on Thanksgiving Day. That's supposed to be a family holiday, Louis." Louis shifted Gage, who looked gigantic and wide-eyed in his first big boy parka, to his other arm. Ellie was at one of the big windows, watching an Air Force helicopter take off. I'm not exactly going to be crying in my beer. Louis said, Judd and Norma are going to have me over for turkey and all the trimmings. Hell, I'm the one who feels guilty. I never liked these big holiday groups anyway. I start drinking in front of some football game at 3 in the afternoon and fall asleep at 7. And the next day, it feels like the Dallas Cowgirls are dancing around and yelling "Bula Bula" inside my head. I just don't like sending you off with the 2 kids. I'll be fine, she said. Flying first class, I feel like a princess. And Gage will sleep on the flight from Logan to O'Hare. You hope, he said, and they both laughed. The flight was called, and Ellie scampered over. That's us, Mommy. Come on, come on. They'll leave without us. No, they won't, Rachel said. She was clenching her 3 pink boarding cards in one hand. She was wearing her fur coat, some fake stuff that was a luxuriant brown. Probably it was supposed to look like a muskrat, Louis thought. Whatever it was supposed to look like, it made her look absolutely lovely. Perhaps something of what he felt showed in his eyes because she hugged him impulsively, semi-crushing Gage between them. Gage looked surprised, but not terribly upset. Louis Creed, I love you, she said. Mommy, Ellie said, now in a fever of impatience. Come on, come on, come on. Oh, all right, she said. Be good, Louis. Tell you what, he said, grinning. I'll be careful. Say hello to your folks, Rachel. Oh, you, she said, and wrinkled her nose at him. Rachel was not fooled. She knew perfectly well why Louis was skipping this trip. Funny. He watched them enter the boarding ramp and disappear from sight for the next week. He already felt homesick and lonely for them. He moved over to the window where Ellie had been, hands stuffed in his coat pockets, watching the baggage handlers loading the hold. The truth was simple. Not only Mr. but also Mrs. Irwin Goldman of Lake Forest had disliked Louis from the beginning. He came from the wrong side of the tracks, but that was just for starters. Worse, he fully expected their daughter to support him while he went to medical school, where he would almost surely flunk out. Louis could have handled this, in fact, had been doing so. Then something happened which Rachel did not know about and never would. Not from Louis anyway. Irwin Goldman had offered to pay Louis's entire tuition through med school. The price of this quote-unquote scholarship, Goldman's word, was that Louis should break off his engagement with Rachel at once. Louis Creed had not been at the optimum time of life to deal with such an outrage, but such melodramatic proposals, or bribes to call a spade, are rarely made to those who are at an optimum time, which might be around the age of 85. He was tired, for one thing. He was spending 18 hours a week in classes, another 20 hitting the books, another 15 waiting tables in a deep dish pizza joint down the block from the Whitehall Hotel. He was also nervous. Mr. Goldman's oddly jovial manner that evening had contrasted completely with his previous cold behavior, and Lewis thought that when Goldman invited him into the study for a cigar, a look had passed from him to his wife. Later, much later, when time had lent a little perspective, Lewis would reflect that horses must feel much the same free-floating anxiety when they smell the first smoke of a prairie fire. He began expecting Goldman to reveal at any moment that he knew Lewis had been sleeping with his daughter. When Goldman instead made his incredible offer, even going so far as to take his checkbook from the pocket of his smoking jacket like a rack in a Noel Coward farce, Lewis had blown up. He accused Goldman of trying to keep his daughter like an exhibit in a museum, of having no regard for anyone but himself, and of being an overbearing, thoughtless bastard. It would be a long time before he would admit to himself that part of his rage had been relief. All of these little insights into Irving Goldman's character, though perhaps true, had no redeeming touch of diplomacy in them. Any semblance of Noel Coward departed. If there was humor in the rest of the conversation, it was of a much more vulgar sort. Goldman told him to get out, and that if he ever saw Lewis on his doorstep again, he would shoot him like a yellow dog. Lewis told Goldman to take his checkbook and plug up his ass with it. Goldman said he had seen bums in the gutter who had more potential than Lewis Creed. Lewis told Goldman he could also shove his goddamn bank card and his American Express gold card right up there beside his checkbook. None of this had been a promising first step toward good relations with the future in-laws. In the end, Rachel had brought them around, after each man had had a chance to repent of the things he had said, although neither of them had ever changed his mind in the slightest about the other. There was no more melodrama, certainly no dismally theatrical "from this day forward I have no daughter" scene. Goldman would have probably suffered through Rachel's marriage to the creature from the Black Lagoon before denying her. Nevertheless, the face rising above the collar of Irving Goldman's morning coat on the day Lewis married Rachel had greatly resembled the faces sometimes seen carved on Egyptian sarcophagi. Their wedding present had been a six-place setting of spode china and a microwave oven. No money. For most of Lewis's harum sacrum med school days, Rachel had worked as a clerk in a woman's apparel store. And from that day to this day, Rachel only knew that things had been and continued to be tense between her husband and her parents, particularly between Lewis and her father. Lewis could have gone to Chicago with his family, although the university schedule would have meant flying back 3 days earlier than Rachel and the kids. that was not a great hardship. On the other hand, 4 days with Imhotep and his wife, the Sphinx, would have been. The children had melted his in-laws a good deal, as children often do. Louis suspected that he himself could have completed the rapprochement simply by pretending he had forgotten that evening in Goldman's study. It wouldn't even matter that Goldman knew he was pretending, but the fact was, and he at least had the guts to be upfront about it himself, that he did not quite want to make the rapprochement. 10 years was a long time, but it was not quite long enough to take away the slimy taste that had come into his mouth when, in Goldman's study over glasses of brandy, the old man had opened one side of that idiotic smoking jacket and removed the checkbook residing within. Yes, he had felt relief that the nights, 5 of them in all, that he and Rachel had spent in his narrow, sagging apartment bed had not been discovered, but that surprised disgust had been quite its own thing, and the years between then and now had not changed it. He could have come, but he preferred to send his father-in-law, his grandchildren, his daughter, and a message. The Delta 727 pulled away from the rampway, turned, and he saw Ellie at one of the front windows waving frantically. Louis waved back, smiling, and then someone, Ellie or Rachel, hiked Gage into the window. Louis waved, and Gage waved back, perhaps seeing him, perhaps only imitating Ellie. "Fly my people safe," he muttered, then zipped his coat and went out to the parking lot. Here, the wind whined and zoomed with force enough to almost tear his hunter's cap off his head, and he clapped a hand to it. He fumbled with his keys to unlock the driver's side door of his car, and then turned as the jet rose beyond the terminal building, its nose tilted upward into the hard blue, its turbos thundering. Feeling very lonely indeed now, ridiculously close to tears, Louis waved again. He was still feeling blue that evening when he recrossed Route 15 after a couple of beers with Judd and Norma. Norma had drunk a glass of wine, something she was allowed, even encouraged to have, by Dr. Weybridge. They had moved into the kitchen tonight in deference to the season. Judd had stoked up the small Merrick stove, and they had sat around it, the beer cold, the heat good, and Judd had talked about the Mimic Indians had starved off a British landing at Mackay's 200 years ago. In those days, the Micmacs had been pretty fearsome, he said, and then added that he guessed there were a few state and federal land lawyers who thought they still were. It should have been a fine evening, but Louis was aware of the empty house waiting for him. Crossing the lawn and feeling the frost crunching under his shoes, he heard the telephone begin to ring in the house. He broke into a run, got through the front door, sprinted through the living room, knocking over a magazine stand, and then slid most of the way across the kitchen, his frosty shoes skidding over the linoleum. He snared at the phone. "Hello?" "Louis?" Rachel's voice, a little distant but absolutely fine. "We're here. We made it. No problems." "Great," he said, and sat down to talk to her, thinking, "I wish to God you were here."